Okay, let's get started. Welcome to quarterfinal QDO2018. We have to show wax technology, QK on the wall, and customers in GG, and you about QDO. Congratulations to all the teams so far. Motion is
terminology is not just a rhetorical term that people use. We think that terminology conveys meaning, specific meaning and background that is actually being created through the etymology of the word. So therefore, we think that in order to make an effective exposure of the LGBTQs in those kind of non-Western countries, and in order to prevent those kind of problems that are resulting from lack of reflecting intersectionality, we are very, very happy to propose this motion. We're going to propose you three things in OG speech, in PM speech. Firstly, about the principle of intersectionality, and secondly, about the harms of using Western terminology in terms of promoting those kind of LGBTQ values in non-Western countries. And thirdly, about the exposure effect, why the exposure can happen under our case, and can also better happen under our case. Before that, one clarification. We think the terminology is important because it makes people categorize people's similarities and differences, so therefore create the expectation and those kind of anticipation for those specific group of people. So therefore, we think that the impact of terminology does not only resist on those kind of like thinking thing, but also has a practical effect. And we are going to prove to you why using Western terminology is actually harmful to promote those kind of LGBTQ values. Three things. Firstly, principle of intersectionality. Intersectionality means that even if some people share the same identity, i.e. LGBTQ being in the sexual minority, they all perceive their identity differently according to their historical backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. So for example, Islamic feminists, they actually push for like wearing niqab, like most of them push for wearing niqab or wearing a burqa, but Western liberal feminists actually, like most of them, actually criticize them for actually surrendering to the patriarchal values or whatnot. But we think that that is also a legitimate option for them to actually wear those burqa and niqab, and by saying that that is a choice, and they are actually harmonizing their religion and their identity as an LGBTQ. We think that those kind of concept of intersectionality is very, very important in this debate because, especially in non-Western communities, their identity as LGBTQ has evolved in a very, very different historical concept than the Western countries, right? So we think that those kind of historical context is also a part of their identity, and therefore they cannot only be limited by the concept of Western terminology of calling them LGBTQ. So we think that by the principle of intersectionality, there is a very high necessity to use those kind of Western liberal, not to use those kind of Western values, Western terminologies in order to promote their values. But before I move on, yes, sir.
So your example is a bit weird because Islam feminism is also using the terminology of feminism and categorized as same.
Okay, we think that, we are going to explain it further, but let me explain very simply. We think that in terms of, because feminism is a very umbrella term, right? The people who actually pursue for those kind of core values are called feminism, but we think that those local communities have to promote those kind of things because Western people are going to explain them with the word they have anyway, so we think that those kind of things can actually will be further explained in my second and third argument. That nicely leads on to our second argument, which is about the harms of using Western terminology. 3 levels of analysis. We think that firstly, using Western terminology makes it very, very difficult to convey the richness of the historical context that is actually conveyed in those kind of LGBTQs forming their identity. Second level analysis. We think that, therefore, it limits the people themselves in the non-Western countries to that concept of Western terminology. We think that Western terminology has evolved in a very, very different context compared to those kind of like non-Western countries. So we think that actually not all people, not all sexual minorities, are actually fully know what they are, like just like we do. Like we do not know about themselves, but they do not know fully about themselves. But in those kind of contexts, we think that when they actually start to limit the concept and learn their identity based on the Western terminology, we think that that is the point where they are actually limiting and self-limiting the concept of who they are and who their identity is, what their identity is. We think that those kind of things are very, very detrimental in terms of forming a healthy identity of those kind of people who do not like fully know their identity before they actually fully know them. Third level analysis. We think that this is also detrimental because we think that there is kind of an anti-sentiment against against Western countries when they actually use them. So we think that when the Western terminologies are being used in terms of explaining those kind of non-Western values, we think that because of those kind of limitation effect, and because they think they themselves think that those Western values are not fully historically fully explain those kind of non-Western values, we think that those types of exposure is being actually conversed. We think that the opposition might say that this is good for exposure in terms of Western communities, but we think that what they really need is the support from the local community, not the support from the Western values first. We think that it may be appropriate to actually make people, Western people, more of a Western people know about those kind of people, but we think that that is only quantitative. We think that those kind of qualitative change should actually happen, promotion should actually happen before those kind of outside people actually know those kind of people inside those kind of non-Western. So therefore, we think that the direction of exposure should be start from inside, adjacent people, and go to outside. And therefore, we think that in terms of promoting those kind of local and promoting support from the local people, we need to use the local terminology that is actually friendly with the local people to actually accept those kind of people that they exist. So they might say that how do we know that they even exist when we do not use Western terminology? But we think that that actually is a vice versa effect, very converse step to actually make an exposure, because we cannot suddenly make those kind of people who live in the far west to actually know about those values and promote their values. We think that the change can happen from inside. Okay, having set that clear, third argument, which is about exposure. We think that exposure can happen even under our side because we think that while explaining local historical terms, we can actually use Western terms. This is not a tension because local people is the only people who can use local historical terms. So when we hear very, very new terms that is not familiar to us, we actually use those kind of terms that are similar, familiar to us, in order to explain those kind of things. But we also acknowledge that this word of Western terminology cannot actually convey the full meaning of those kind of local historical words, right? So therefore, we think that those kind of local historical terms, while explaining those kind of things, we use Western terms. So we think that exposure can happen. Why exposure can better happen on our side, which is our positive material. We think that by learning new terms, you actually learn the behind the concept or those kind of historical background behind the word. Because let's make a comparison. When we use an already existing term that is actually familiar with our daily life, we do not ponder upon the meaning of that word, right? So that is inside our daily usage of the word. So therefore, when we actually use the term familiar with us, you do not actually think, even if you do not know the Western term fully, you do not ponder upon the concept of that word. But on the other hand, when you use local historical terms that are not familiar to us, we think that while learning this new term, and while learning this new terms actually exist, you actually learn about the etymology of the word, and you know about the historical background, and why this kind of word is created, and why these people are called by this word. So we think that by promoting those kind of non-Western terms and local historical terms, we actually convey into the principle of intersectionality, and also we prevent the harms of using Western terminology in terms of anti-sentiment and those kind of identity crisis. And third, we actually achieve better exposure. So we are very, very proud and happy.
The House of the Prime Minister is invited to your motion.
Thank you, honorable panels. Terminology has a strong power to change the people's mindsets. But unfortunately, because of the background of the local terminology, what they are talking is accompanying the huge discrimination or historical discrimination towards the local people. That's why it's quite difficult for the situation is really stagnated because of this kind of historical discrimination towards such kind of LGBT, local LGBT people. That's why we need more strong power because strong power in the Western countries, which have LGBTQ plus is also umbrella term which can protect the local people in non-Western countries. That's why we really proud to oppose this motion. So all remarks are integrated in my speech. So firstly, I will actually explain what is the problem which surrounding the local term of the LGBTQ, and second, I'm gonna explain why LGBTQ plus has a strong power to change the current stagnation, and third of all, I'd like to compare as principal prioritization which side of house should be prioritized. So let's move on to my first issue about why the current local term of the LGBTQ cannot change their situation. So as I mentioned, even in such occasion, which Singapore or Indonesia or such kind of things, even such kind of people are still suffering from the historical discrimination which accompany towards the local term of the LGBTQ, and that's why their self-esteem or confidence about their identity is still weak comparing with other kind of sexual minority people. And also, that in that occasion, the people, this kind of ideology of each term, like lesbian or gay people or bisexual people, are isolated from each kind of sexual identity people. That's why these kind of people already strongly suffer from their sense of isolation or the sense of discrimination from from the mainstream society or from the other straight people. So that is a problem. That is a problem. First, local LGBT people are suffering, but on the contrary, in our side of house, by adapting westernized terminology of the LGBTQ+, it can change. It can provide a breakthrough such kind of stagnation in that nation. So firstly, because it can be regarded as a new idea towards the current conservative or traditional people, and so because as I mentioned, on that occasion in their side of the house, the local people think that each kind of the sexual orientation is different, and it's isolated or it's loneliness. It feels loneliness, but because of the unifying such all kinds of sexual minority towards one single word, they can feel a sense of unified, and also in that local occasion, the Western culture is one of the dominant culture in this society, and it feels like more attractive, but it seems to more sophisticated towards the people, and also that kind of culture has a huge authority towards the local people, and because this kind of LGBTQ+ is successfully recognized as the one valid and one reasonable sexual orientation in the Western countries. That's why this kind of the current situation of the sexual minorities can be thrown into the local situation, same as the Western country. Yes.
So when social movement evolves to a certain level, for example, feminism, even if they are all feminism, most Western feminists do not empathize with Islamic feminists. Are you saying that LGBTQ Western people are going to suddenly unite themselves with those kind of minor LGBTQs just by using Western terminology?
Maybe it cannot be suddenly, but gradually it can grow. It can cause a breakthrough towards towards India side of us. So as I explained to you that this for the local people, the value of the LGBT or the concept of the LGBT is really not enlightened in their side of house. That is a problem we want to solve by adapting the LGBTQ process. So finally, let's move on to our principal prioritization. Even if to certain extent we have a risk to lose some historical background or tradition of such kind of local terminology, why we need to prioritize to adapt that kind of westernized terminology of LGBT. Of course, maybe to some extent we can lose some of the true meaning or exact meaning of the word of their sexual orientation in the local situation, but their core meaning of their sexual orientation can be sustained even in the term of the LGBTQ process, and also uniquely in our side of us, thanks to the term or thanks to the power of the LGBTQ plus, we can decrease or we can mitigate the current discrimination or current discrimination or preconception against the LGBTQ plus. That is the most fundamental wish of the LGBTQ minorities. because as they explained that those kind of people, these kind of people have been suffering from this kind of this historical discrimination so long time or so permanently. That's why in our side of us we can bring more tangible benefit towards the people, the victim of such historical discrimination or the historical biases towards the LGBTQ pluses. So in the end of the day, from the opening operation, we want to say that to rely on the power of the LGBT or rather the power of the westernized culture, we can save the more and more people who are suffering from the current situation because of the historical discrimination or preconception we refer to oppose.
Have some speaker is invited to become
Mr. and Madam Speakers, our opponents today tell you, majorly their harm is this, that historical discrimination is prevalent against these communities. But the problem is this, they fail to mechanize their case, as in they fail to prove what tangible change they will actually bring upon these communities. Let me specify. First, I think they fail to explain to us why will the Western movements lose all incentive to cooperate with these oppressed minority communities as soon as Western terminologies are not used. Because I think that that's, because if it's true that these people and the Western liberal LGBTQIA communities empathize with the general principle of these people, that these people are oppressed people because of their sexual identities, then I think by a moral principle and by moral consistency, they already have a legitimate incentive to unite and actually cooperate with these people, if that's the case. And if their unique benefit is exposure, which is actually my second question, even if we give them the benefit of exposure, which they don't get to take, I'm going to explain why. What can Western pro-LGBTQIA movements tangibly do for these people? Because if they're talking about media exposure, look, I don't think media, or like Western media, like BBC or all these media corporations lose incentive to go into these communities and report the unique LGBTQIA culture of these communities as soon as Western culture is not used. I don't think that that is a comparative benefit that they get to take in this debate. Actually, I think it creates more incentive for these BBCs and Western media corporations to go in. Because what creates viewership and what creates interest for these communities is the unique aspects of culture and the unique aspects of LGBTQIA, unique to that culture, unique to that community, that generates better viewership. Because you have LGBTQIA movements basically everywhere in the universe to a certain extent, right? So what makes it unique is the selling point for these media corporations to come in. I think that we generate better media exposure to begin with. But number three, about exposure, right? Now, and this is the comparative of this debate, because I don't think that that is a unique benefit that they get to take as well. Because we need to accept reality, that Westerners will describe and explain the local historical terms to their Western people using Western terminology anyway. That happens on both sides of the house anyway. So the contention in this debate is whether these people should represent themselves using their own technology, and I think that's the change point in this debate. All the benefits, therefore, that protrude from or are contingent upon this idea that Westerners will be able to create generally better exposure by using Western terminologies for these people, I think that it's a benefit that exists on both sides. I don't think that that's a mutual benefit that they get to sell. But I think that they ignore many of the problems and many of the issues we regarded and explained to you regarding intersectionality, right? We told you that their version of LGBTQIA+ is different on a historical and cultural level, which is what makes it fundamentally unexplainable to the fullest extent using Western terminology. Once these people start using Western terminology to propagate their values and educate their young ones, for instance, or newly accepted members of their community, plenty, what happens is that they compromise and cut off the unique, unexplainable by Western terminology aspects of their culture and their communities. What happens, therefore, is when these people educate the next generation, or the people with other people, with newly accepted people in their communities using this education, that is only what's left of it. So future generation, it would be only educated using these kind of terminologies. So as generations passed on, the unique aspects of their culture will be cut off continuously until only Western terminology-wise explainable cultures left. I think that that compromises their culture, that compromises their community's fundamental values to begin with. Before I move on, yes sir?
Tell me the reason and steps why a guy who is even indifferent in sexual minority issue in general will be suddenly interested in such difference in the cultural and historical context.
No, number one, I think that if that is a problem you raised, then that same problem exists under your model. Because again, if a guy is a bigot, like you say, an unchangeable people that are fundamentally hateful towards the LGBTQI community to begin with, just using Western terminologies will not really solve the problem and does not necessarily bring better exposure. And I think that this is one of the problems that they miss, because we told you that adjacency is the issue in this debate, right? Because no matter how much Western pressure they might be able to bring, like for instance, media exposure, even if that happens better on their model, I think that they don't bring actual tangible legal changes to these communities within governments or nations that are fundamentally oppressive against these communities. Because I think that if we're talking about LGBT, like QI communities that are historically oppressed like they are, they actually characterize, I think the situation would probably be that the surrounding communities or the surrounding nation around that community would probably be anti-Western or at least anti-LGBTQIA to begin with, right? If that is the case, I don't think that even if Western nations like actually pressure these conservative communities that surround these small LGBTQI communities, I don't think that this necessarily brings change, right? Because these people will be against these people anyway. So if that's the exposure analogy that they want to bring, I don't think that their exposure analogy brings a unique benefit to this debate. Rather, if exposure and fundamental change is very hard to begin with, I think that even if we talk about exposure as an even if case, we bring it better. But number two, at least the marginal benefit that comes from our side is that the essence of this culture is much better preserved now that education and education of these values to a future generation and perhaps representation of their own values through unique cultural values of these communities happens better on our model. So what happens is our culture is not compromised, their culture is compromised without bringing any tangible benefits to the community. I think that if exposure is the issue that they're so concerned about, they need to explain why this exposure happens better. Because if you're talking about bigoted people, they will not really listen to these communities to begin with, right? But we question why Western pro-LGBT movements cannot support these groups to begin with. Because first I mentioned about principle, but number two, I think that we live in a global era where generally information about various communities, even minority communities that are really isolated, are generally spread throughout the global community, right? In which case, I think that there is enough information for these people, even without this exposure, to go and actually acknowledge that these communities exist and actually lend them support. If that's the benefit, if unity is the benefit that they actually propose, which I don't think is necessarily a benefit to begin with, because there are, even with the example of feminism, there are so many different factions and so many different ideals that actually group themselves together, even using different terminologies. I think that even if the value of unity is so important, we take that better. So on these terms, A, because we do not compromise our unique culture. B, because I don't think their exposure happens, and even if it doesn't bring tangible change. I think we take this debate. Here, here.
Have some free invite me here.
I have to explain three things. Firstly, please follow below how the discriminative one that local community should be changed under the status quo. The second of all, I'd like to explain the practical benefit of having under the status quo, and someday I'd like to explain the practical harm under the status quo, for instance, using the local historical term caused by harm. The all argumentation coming from the opening campaign is based on because the people could understand the history of the local community, that's why it can be the better situation of the LGBTQI people. But we say that clear premise of this debate is that the fundamental LGBT movement is based on the Western country, unfortunately. For those reasons, the current LGBT movement is advancing in the Western country. Unfortunately, non-Western country, the less advanced country of the LGBT movement. That's the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, clearly existence of the discuss, or the, to some extent, people can understand the importance of the LGBT people locally, but actually they cannot understand the importance of the LGBT. That's the clear reason why in this debate, the premise of the non-Western country situation of the LGBTQI people. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, given the situation of this premise, what they are talking about is because they are likely to use discriminative word from the historically term, and the people's mind are going to change, going to be changed. But after taking this proposal, under governmental paradigm, we say that because people are going to see that under the status quo, the LGBTQI people are discriminated. And the term they are going to use is the discriminative word. They are likely to find the common point of the LGBT, common point of the local community and the discriminative situation. For those reasons, in their paradigm never happened in the good point of their side of the house. Having clarified this, let me explain our argumentation. Firstly, please follow me. We say that, as I explained in my introduction, because of the situation of the non-Western country is less advanced compared with the LGBT movement. That's the reason why, ladies and gentlemen, the term of the LGBT terminology used in the local community is a discriminating word under the status quo. That's the reason why, for example, the political correctness happens in America or the UK because this is a discriminating word for the women, or some LGBT, some minority, sexual orientation minority people. That's why given the accessibility of the old people, the world are going to be changed as 50 years ago or 100 years ago. That's why, given the situation of the LGBT term, we say the discriminative word existence in local community. That shouldn't be used in the first place. That's why, given the situation of the political correctness, this situation is the same in the first place. Then based on the second argumentation, practical benefit after this proposal. The opening government pointed out that opening government failed to explain why under official paradigm, the LGBT movement cannot be succeeding in the local community by using the Western terminology. But we say that Western culture has a huge power to spread the information in the first place. The three reasons are here. Number one, because no, thank you. Because as I explained in my introduction, because they have a discriminating feeling towards LGBT people, unfortunately, the local community. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, they are going to think that the new terms is necessary. After introducing a new terminology and after seeing the Western LGBT movement in Western country situation, they are going to sympathize all the LGBTQI people and move LGBT people, LGBT people are very, very well in the Western country. That's why the discriminating word should be used, and after that, LGBTQI people, QI term is a general term for themselves because they are because seeing the Western country is a unique way of themselves. That's why after under status quo, because of the existence of Western terminology, spread the information and the gay parade or the gay marriage are going to be considered by citizens because of using the terminology, and the terminology is directly leading to the situation, directly leading the people's mind, which is explained by the opening government. We say that the terminology of the Western terminology is extremely important. We say for those reasons, the second analysis are here. Because unfortunately, the LGBT people is minority. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, it is necessary for majority people to be changed in the first place. For those reasons, if the plight coming from the opening government is extremely important, but we say that to move the LGBT movement in local community or non-Western country, we say it is important for them to make majority move in the first place. That's why if they use LGBT term and LGBT movement inspire non-Western country, the situation are going to be better and better. For those reasons, even in our paradigm, LGBT terminology, using the Western terminology that is LGBT, are going to make the situation succeed in the non-Western countries. Thirdly, I like to explain the practical harm after making the proposals. Before that, yes.
Okay, just by using non-Western terms, why are these minorities excluded from the Western discussion regarding LGBTQ, even though Western people will still use Western terms to explain the existence of those local terms?
We never say that LGBT a Western LGBT movement should support both non-Western countries in the first place. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, argumentation coming from opening government is pushed the burden on the opposition side by saying that it has to be necessary to explain why in the paradigm the Western country has to support the country that is not burden from in the first place. Let me explain the third point, practical harm of this proposal. Because the benefit, benefit coming from under their side of the house is the identity crisis of the majority people. We say that culture is flexible. That's why given the situation all over the world, non-Western countries are applying the Western country culture in the first way. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, Japan is a culture that refuses the Western culture at first, but after the Meiji era, the Japanese culture are going to be adapted in the first place. That's why the part coming from their side of the past is not so harm in the first place. The culture is flexible. For those reasons, the correct reason why they think to the culture is not important in this debate. More importantly, we say that after taking this proposal, the people going to see the common point of the LGBT terminology and the local discrimination terminology and the action of the LGBT people. Unfortunately, today's premise is that non-Western country is a country where the people cannot fully understand the LGBTQI movement importance. For those reasons, we say that to inspire the majority people to adapt the Western terminology that are likely to affect the Western situation, it is extremely important to take this motion. For those reasons, we are very proud to oppose.
Have some speaker bringing up recording how the mic member got it.
Chair, panel, don't let opening opposition get away with a very shallow analysis about language and a one-liner analysis about political correctness and culture being flexible in the first place. And also, don't let opening governments get away with a very shallow rebuttal about that very important point in the first place, right? Before going on to our substantive, 3 points to point out on that chart. Firstly, the problem is that they say that those Western terminologies are going to be considered as more effective and more sophisticated. We will tell you in our substantives why this will lead to a perpetual state of colonialism and whatnot. Secondly, we tell you that this is simply factually not true, right? Because the enclosed slide itself says there is a rich history of community of LGBTQ communities. We think that these ideas considered to be new is factually wrong to begin with. Thirdly, they don't really explain why this is a good thing to begin with, right? Because we think telling people that there is a rich history of a social movement and telling people that there are a lot of LGBTQ people around you leads to more empathy and leads to a more integration and inclusiveness of the movement for LGBTQ movements to move forward in those oppressive states. Secondly, don't let opening opposition get away with saying that we need the support of the majority for a movement to go forward in the first place. Because first, they don't really give us any solvency or mechanism because we don't clearly see why using Western terminology will lead to more support in the first place. And secondly, we think this is very patronizing for them to say that we need the support of first world nations and whitewash white feminism from the start and to the start and whatnot. Now, this is how we would like to contextualize the debate instead. We would like to tell you that we live in a postmodern society where we think the language that we use shapes the world around you and makes the scopes that we see the world. We tell you to look at the actual context that we are working in. We're talking about countries like India. We're talking about countries like Indonesia. The states that were in the state of colonialism and are still under the state of colonialism. We tell you that the Western feminism is actually relegating women and LGBTQ movements in third world countries to a permanent state of oppression and remnants of colonialism to the start, which makes us very firstly, we would like to contextualize this. First, we think that those Western whitewashed feminism hinders independence from the start because we think that those Western terminologies are so under the framework of West colonial hegemons that were transplanted by those colonial nations to begin with, right? And we would like to correctly contextualize the effect of language on people because first, we think that those Western terminologies are whitewashed to begin with, and secondly, those language also carries the hegemons of the ideologies of colonial states. That's why many colonial regimes forcibly try to integrate and educate children of those colonial colonized nations in order to integrate them forcibly and integrate their cultures into theirs. We think this is principally not justified. Thirdly, we think that the premise of all of their side is under a very patronizing premise that third world countries' feminism and LGBTQ movements should be very easy to understand by first world nations, which we think we haven't heard any principal justification coming from them. Even though OG said, oh, first world nations are going to be interesting, we don't think that is a very important issue to begin with because what we think is more important is a community support and addressing the right problems inside the community that have been perpetualized in historical oppressions. D, we also tell you that when we promote those indigenous terminologies, we're also going to use and integrate those local terminologies also into trauma therapy or whatnot in order to take care of people who are undergoing extreme trauma, especially considering that in those oppressive states, LGBTQ movements are not really acknowledged to begin with. Now, going on to our principal analysis. Firstly, we tell you that the very harm of Western feminism is that it creates an ahistorical account of LGBTQ movements from the start. That means that it works as a justification for the history of colonialism that has perpetuated. Why? Because we tell you that the many excuses that colonialism takes is that it tells those states that they were the ones who liberated women, when instead the influence slave itself tells you that there was a rich history of LGBTQ movements that have been constantly trying to liberate not only women, but LGBTQ movements to begin with. We think the ideology that the West was the only agency for those countries to get gender equality is a justification for colonialism in and of itself, not only to mention that this is a very ahistorical and wrong account of history to begin with. Why is this so harmful? Because we tell you that the many colonialism violence was masculinized violence to begin with, and secondly, we tell you that those Western nations are the ones who perpetuated and internalized patriarchy in those states, like India, for example, right? Because we see those colonial states playing with religious and ethnic divisions and describing certain religions or ethnic communities as feminine or as masculine or whatnot. We see that those colonial and Western states were the actual ones who perpetuated and relegated those nations into the state of gender inequality, and we don't think it is a right thing to make those third world nations work under the concept of Western feminism to begin with. Now, going on to a practicality that wasn't really substantiated by the OG. No, thank you, sir. We have three things to say. Firstly, we say that that is more inclusive because we tell you that Western terminologies require more capital and more technologies to be accessed in the first place. Because we tell you in third world nations where there aren't much education, you need much more capital, much more upper class in order to access those Western terminologies to begin with. That means that this will lead to the division of women and LGBTQ movements from the start. Secondly, we tell you that this leads to a perpetuation of trauma because you can't express your feelings in your own language, and that's why we told in your model that we're going to integrate this into trauma therapy as well. Secondly, we tell you that we are more intersectional, right? Because realize that in those colonial states, there are a lot of ethnic divisions to begin with. That means that first, we cannot unilaterally make people use the same terminology. But second, we also tell you that they have hostility against the West, and we don't think making people using Western terminologies will lead to the forwardment or embetterment of those movements to begin with. Thirdly, this leads to more exposure, and we tell you that this can only happen with using indigenous terminologies because it will lead to more research. Because we tell you, because we would like to tell you that not using those terminologies actually hides the history behind LGBTQ movements, which will hinder research instead of exposing it. Although we don't think that is a very important point, we think that in every process of this debate, we're the ones who are going to send these very practical proposals.
Have some speaker is invited. very much.
Don't just let away closing government by saying the problem is whitewashing. Don't just let away the government bench by not proving us how under their side of the house the problem are going to get better, right? Because government bench shares the problem that they are a discrimination towards the sexual minority. If they are not going to prove us how organic change is going to happen, sorry what to say, the debate is going to be even, right? Because both is worst case scenario. What we are going to be doing for closing opposition is going to be resolving the deadlock between the opening opposition and opening government. We think the opening opposition did a good job in pointing out the correct assertion, but sorry, you guys didn't have enough logic to support that. What is the deadlock that we're going to be supporting? So, opening government talked about like Westerns, they are anti-Western sentiment, and opening opposition talked about how people can associate better to the Western. What we're going to be proving on our side is that how internally, domestically, and also in terms of external, like foreign capital, how we can have a better achievement in terms of protection of sexual minority. But proving that, two clarifications coming from closing opposition. First thing is, let me just be clear about what is the trade-off, what this movement are going to look like, right? So if we look at what this info slide is actually talk about, the movement under the government may look like this. It will be like Mahi J movement, right? I don't think it's that intuitive on a comparative to Western movement, but on a comparative, what we're going to be supporting is the LGBTQ plus movement, right? Here comes the second clarification. The term queer doesn't represent a particular gender preferences or sexual orientation in the first place. What does this mean? This means all of the things that they're talking about can be included in the queer category, right? And we don't think the generalization or categorization harm that they talk about is going to happen. And also, we think this the opening government's example is actually fatal and going to kill their case. Why so? Because they have supported the example of Muslim feminism, for example, right? What does this mean? The women's rights have progressed by, for example, gaining right to vote from the very fundamental level, right? And after that, the feminism have divided into Muslim feminism or white feminism, right? What we can see as a result of this is that after achieving the basic rights, these movements are able to divide, right? That's why all of the problem that they're talking about is secondary on a comparison to achieving the fundamental right that we're supporting on the outside of the house. So what is the fundamental problem that we see in the status quo? We see inequality and marriage. How are we going to be achieving on the outside of the house? So here comes the extension. First, let's talk about the foreign capital. The reason why foreign capital becomes important in this debate is because specialization from external country is something really effective in the first place, which they have just neglected. I'm going to give you the logic for that, right? The reason is really simple. If we look at an example of Saudi Arabia, the reason why women are now able to drive a car was because of the constant specialization from other Western countries. And the reason why this is likely to happen is because Saudi Arabia have a massive incentive to cooperate with Western countries like USA because they are importing oil. They have massive economical tie and cultural tie at the same time. That's why this specialization becomes extremely effective. That's why we can say this external pressure is something a really important contention. Then the question is, which side of the house can achieve a better external specialization? We say it's better under our side. Why so? Because as I told you in my first clarification, we don't think this Mahijai movement is something going to be really appealing for everyone. Because it's too optimistic for government side to just assume that everybody are able to understand this term. What is most important in movement in general? It is most important to gain the biggest amount of human capital, right? That's why it has to be simple and easy for people to understand. There are people who do know what LGBT is, but who don't know what Mahijai is, right? That's why it's important to make it simple as possible so that many people can subscribe to the same idea. Especially if we look at the Western context, this is the most familiar term. That is why on our side of the house we can achieve a bigger recognition in that very beginning. But on second level, let's move on to the domestic level, and I'm gonna be resolving the deadlock between opening opposition and opening government. And we say that assertion of opening opposition is actually correct. That the people in this like Southeastern Asia people have a strong association to Western culture. I'm gonna give you why it's actually true. So firstly, because I have already pointed out in my example, they have a cultural tie and economical tie in the first place, and the government of this Southeastern Asian country also have an incentive to be nice to Western Western country, right? That's why it's gonna be easier to personalize. But on the second level, in the 21st century, we have a tool called SNS, right? Twitter and Facebook. That's why many of the culture, and also Twitter or Facebook is ran by Western companies, right? That's why the viewpoint from Western viewpoint is something likely to be familiar also in those in India or those kind of countries that they have pointed out, right? That's why we think it's also something easy to associate with. But thirdly, if in the current status quo, for example, many of the people are like actresses or like actresses in Hollywood have declared that they are LGBT, right? What does this mean? Because the people in developing country or the Southeastern Asian country do have interest to the pop culture, and because these like famous people are going to declare the support to LGBT right movement, we say people have more interest in and at least know the concept of what LGBT is and know that many people are supporting LGBT at the same time. But on the third level, we think many of the dominant source of, or the textbook or source of education is oftentimes provided by the Western media. For example, textbook is oftentimes written in English and also already have a dominant viewpoint from Western. That's why we think Western term is something familiar in the very beginning for these people. So why this becomes important? So we need to understand who we need to address, right? The person, the character or the group of the people that we need to make to combine with is the person who don't really support this LGBT right? Because these are the people who need to change, right? There are no more need to actually appeal to liberal people. That's why it's much more important to appeal to the person who don't really have interest to what Mahije is in the first place. That's why if you look at how the general public react, we think it's highly likely that these people subscribe to much more simpler. Go.
If your benefit is that not non-existent in the liberal people, why are your mechanisms worse? Because your mechanism is to influence those liberal people with those Western terminologies.
Sorry, I didn't really mean in that way, because I said it's not that important to appeal to the most liberal people, but we need to appeal to the swing person who don't really have that massive liberal or massive conservative idea, right? People on the middle ground is something important, and we think it's not likely to appeal to our side, because there are pop culture already, there are SNS already, there are textbook already, right? That's why we think this term is something familiar at the very get-go. But on the final level, we think they are a person who subscribes to the concept of LGBT already also in those regions, right? What does this mean? If we are to divide the movement, that is when this movement are going to lose the collective power, right? But if all of the people are going to be under the same umbrella of queer, for example, that is when they have a bigger influence within that domestic country, right? That is why it's going to be much more easier to achieve a gay right. They talk about the self-actualization and stuff, but I think it's much more important, fundamental, to at least achieve gay right? But more if they are to talk about this misrepresentation, I think it's already happening in status quo. We don't really say lesbian marriage or bisexual marriage, but we just say gay marriage, because it's going to be really simple and people can understand the idea. For all that reason, because we think it is the most inclusive and most effective mechanism, we think it's CEO take this debate.
Have some speaker invite commenting. Yeah.
It seems like in this debate, all the other teams other than CG's whole case is contingent upon the premise that Western unity between this third world and Western country are important, which we don't think is quite true. And sadly, OG agreed on this too. We think that the reason why we think that these feminism and these LGBT plus movement should take a local level is because we gave you a lot of reasons. We told you why independence is important. We told you why it's related to a history of colonization. And we told you why people cannot congregate because they don't know these words to begin with. And sadly, we didn't hear any sustainable response about our materials coming from Seoul. So before getting into kind of rebuttals or this question, let's just make our stances clear. We
bring you two clear stances. Firstly, we tell you that LGBTQ plus movement should and must take place in a local level. And secondly, we tell you that the Western terminology related to LGBTQ plus movement hinders localization of LGBTQ plus movement. So let's move on to the first aspect about this. Firstly, why is it so necessary that LGBTQ plus movement should take place at a local level? And we don't think that OJ quite clearly told this to us because they kind of contradicted themselves by saying that on one hand they see uniqueness important, but on the other hand they say this kind of conceding to uniting with other forces is important. And the reason why we think that unity or exposure is actually toxic to the LGBTQ plus movement in the third world place is because as follows. Firstly, we told you that there is three reasons. Firstly, we told you that given the colonial test of feminism, we told you that it is related to the rhetoric of any historic Western intervention, which actually justifies Western intervention. It gives the rhetoric that those Western people are the ones who liberate these people, and those Western peoples are the ones who liberate this LGBTQ plus movement from discrimination. And secondly, we believe that it ultimately because of the first reason, we think that it undermines the fruits that are gained by the LGBTQ plus movement in the first place. And when that happens, we think that it further resounds the rhetoric that Western people are the ones who liberate the LGBTQ plus movement. And thirdly, now this is important, we think that those Western terminologies or those Western ideals simply do not fit into the local environment of the LGBTQ plus movement. Why is this? Because we think that given that this Western terminology or Western history actually serves as a set example or actually serves as a set answer for these third world countries to follow, we don't think that we think it is quite harmful because it means that all the things that you are independently gonna do are not the answer, but this is the answer that is provided by the Western world. So let's move on to the second stance, liberatory. So why Western terminology hinders local level movement? Well, OG simply said that terminology is important because people think in those languages. We think that there is a lot more to that than that. That's two reasons. Firstly, you have to think about the connotations that this Western language, the Western terminology carries. We told you that it embodies Western ideals that are closely related to this LGBTQ plus movement. And why is this harmful? Firstly, as we continuously told you, and as they continuously ignored, we told you that it is closely related to the colonization or the patronization of the third world countries to begin with. And we also told you that it is clearly related to the rape populace that are related to the LGBTQ plus movement. And secondly, now this is the most important extension that we bring to you, and this is the direct touch to their domestic argument that we bring to you. So we don't think that any of the teams in this debate is taking the kind of context of these third world countries into account. We are talking about third world countries, non-Western countries, who have the past of being colonized, who are living in a very subsistence level, and who are very poor. And when we're talking about those African countries which are very poor, we can simply expect that every single citizen in that nation knows what LGBTQ plus movement, knows what lesbian means, knows what gay means. And we think that given that it requires a lot more economic capital and it requires a lot more education to understand that kind of terminology, we think that it hinders the congregation or expression of their own identities. And that's why we continuously told you about the trauma therapy for congregating people and making movements. And why is this important? Threefold. We told you that it is important because people do not have the ability to express themselves, given that those who are related, given that they're normal people who are not educated, who don't know what lesbian means, but who knows the meaning of lesbian in their own terminology, they cannot express themselves to others because they can go to doctors and explain about lesbian. And secondly, we think that it actually undermines the congregation of the movement. Look, they talk about bringing the general people into public. They talk about bringing general public into one. And we don't think that that can happen under their paradigm, because given the context of these third world countries, we don't think that people are familiar with the words of LGBTQ plus movement in the first place. But at the comparative level, we provide the congregation of the people, and we provide the we provide the more efficient LGBTQ plus movement, because we bring people together under the familiar term. We bring people under the term that all the people in that society can understand, and that's why congregation or LGBTQ plus movement or at domestic level happens better, and they did not engage in this. So, and they asked about the organic change. And here's the mechanism about the organic change. We think that given that these people can congregate under the name of, under the term of LGBTQ plus movement, in which they can understand, we think that it is a lot more likely for them to make an organic change, unlike the CEO is trying to characterize. Now, there's one thing just I want to their point about the domestic level is it happens better under our comparative. We think that the only thing that we have to rebut to the CEO is about their foreign capital. Firstly, we don't think that this is exclusive extension coming from CFO because it was already mentioned by the Oval in the first place. Secondly, we don't think that the reason why those Saudi Arabia allowed women to drive was not because Western forces were strong, but it is contingent upon the domestic movement. It is contingent upon the symbol of LGBTQ, symbol of feminism movement in Saudi Arabia. It is contingent upon the women going to the street and asking for their license. And when this foreign argument itself is contingent upon the domestic argument, we don't think that their argument but foreign capital actually overwhelms the domestic argument that we provided to you. And we don't think, being perfectly consistent under their logic, we don't see the reason why other countries that are called cosmopolitan are not giving same amounts of rights to the females in the status quo. Because if we say that Western, as long as once you have Western pressure, then these countries will be somewhat favorable to the females. We don't quite get the mechanism because there are other countries which are cosmopolitan but simply do not give certain rights to the movement, and that's why foreign pressure is not important for these third world countries, but actually domestic movement and the congregation under their familiar terms is more important in this debate. For all these reasons, we go to the semi-final.
Have some speaker in must be like opposition head.
Side-affirmative illustrates the harms of not being able to represent it in a nuanced way. We totally concede to that problem. But the question we propose from closing opposition is it right now that we should care about that problem? Is it right now that we should prioritize the nuanced representation over achieving the more fundamental right deprivation, acquisition that we specifically pointed out? Two things from opposition week. First of all, which type can get attention, and second, the central comparison in this debate about nuanced representation versus the more progression of that movement by getting more resource and getting more attention. But before that, some independent engagement, right? So closing proposition told you it will discard people who belong to the minority like Hijra and so forth. We don't think this is the case, because the message that we'd like to send and we will send is not that those people are fucking different, those people should be excluded from the LGBT plus movement, but rather to say those people are all in part of this movement, in part of this queer movement that claims the rights for Saudi. That's exactly what we're doing right now at the moment, right? So basically, we won't exclude those minorities. That's kind of nonsensical. And also, we pointed out from closing opposition that the example that they used, only example that they used about feminists and local feminism, like Muslim feminism, is actually killing their case, because they didn't recognize the time frame of how exactly that movement actually progresses, right? So they only after we got basic right fulfilled, that issue actually came out, right? So we think achieving those things is far more prioritized in any kind of movement. So having that said, moving on to the first issue about which gets attention. So the key contention from their side is it loses attention and causes anti-Western sentiment because by using different terminology. Now, first of all, if people on the ground already have that much strong and positive emotional tie to localized culture and terminology to the extent that they hate the invasion of the West and cause anti-Semitism, anti-Western sentiment, probably they don't discriminate people from that culture that they hold in esteem to begin with, right? The reason why they discriminate is because they don't know it. It's that they're indifferent with that issue. We think that is far more pernicious issue on our side of the house. And secondly, Baba clearly pointed out that we can get more attention because the local movement on our side of the house can utilize already established, enriched attention and resources of Western thank you movement. Like we told you that many pop stars and Hollywood actresses and actors are claiming for gay rights and LGBT rights in general, even coming out by themselves, so thank you. And the crucial point here is that those contents like Hollywood and stuff, pop culture, stuff like that, is also popular amongst those people, random people living in those non-Western states, right? We do know about Tom Cruise, even if you don't live in Western culture. I don't really know whether he claims for gay rights, but that's the thing, right? That's why we can get more attention on our side of the house. We also pointed out, and thank you, that textbook and all of those things written in English are far more comprehensive for those individuals because they access those things, and they, on their side of the house, they need to create another YouTube video for explaining what right for those hijra is about. But on our side of the house, we can utilize already existing contents that are actually claiming for those gay rights movement, stuff like that, with pop stars inside it, right? We think this is a far more effective strategy to get that attention on our side of the house, and thanks. And then they told you media will still report. First of all, I didn't know any of those terms in the info slide actually, despite the fact that I am interested in LGBT right movement. So people don't know actually. So, and secondly, they missed the comparative, right? On their side of the house, well, people will still be interested, might be, but the thing is, the association and tie we get under their side is far more likely to be solid on our side, where we can have the common ground and get attention collectively from those people living in Western nations. So that's what we believe. On our side of the house, we can get more attention and therefore more resources and political capital, human capital, to push that cause within that society. Opening.
Okay, if your target is the conservative people who are highly unlikely to be positive for Western values, why are your solution using Western terminology to change them?
Conservative people who really hate those minorities won't change. We are targeting people who are right at the middle, who are not interested in the first place. Let's go to the central comparison of nuanced representation. Their case about nuanced representation had three faults. First of all, they didn't tell what kind of nuanced representation is actually necessary. The only example they gave you was about religious and Muslim feminism. I don't really get the point about representation. Secondly, at least they basically share the same kind of grievances because they share, at least they are in sexual minority, and disrespect and harassment and offense and ignorance in sexual minorities basically shared, right? And also, gravity of that harm is quite different. We are talking about daily offense, right to marriage, supporting public facility like toilet and so forth, precisely because of the fact that these people are ignored by people around. They don't care about those issues. That fundamental right is not achieved right now. Closing proposition talked about another case about colonialism. Well, first of all, it's different because we don't really have the active incentive to pamper those individuals on the ground. We have the incentive to help those people. We don't really understand what's the harm of it. But when they talked about dependency on Western nations, our economic development, stuff like that, is also about that, right? So we don't see unique harm about leading to colonialism under their side of the house. So what we told you is that we can actually exploit and utilize resources in Western nations, getting attention from people from whom we should get attention
right now at the moment, and we can't pressurize individuals. So movement is about change. Even if nuanced representation is ultimate goal we should ultimately pursue, if it hinders chance to progress right now at the moment for more fundamental rights that we think is important, we shouldn't take that sort of strategy, and we're very happy to stand on the position.